I'm honored this evening to be asked to pay tribute to Jessica Huntley. She was a Guyanese woman of indomitable spirit. She was known as an encourager of many who wanted to say something but had no audience. I shall pay tribute to her by sharing my paraphrase of Ali Mazrui's speech delivered at the National Cultural Center in 1988 to mark the 150th anniversary of emancipation of African enslavement. His was the opening allocution of the conference. Collective martyrdom in modern history, from the Mandingos to the Mandelas. The martyr in the religious and ideological sphere suffers victimization for his or her beliefs. The martyr in the racial sphere suffers victimization for his or her identity. Christians in ancient Rome were pure belief martyrs. Africans during enslavement by Europeans were purely identity martyrs. The Jews in Europe were a combination of two, belief and identity, since being a Jew is part an ethnic thing and part a religious thing. The Jews have managed to turn their suffering under the Nazis into religious doctrine, God's chosen people, as well as a political resource. Africans have neither secularized their suffering into a sacred doctrine nor exploited it as a political fund. The Mandingo or Malinke symbolized African martyrdom at the most poignant. They were once empire builders, Mali Empire, and also innovative scholars. Centuries later, they were among the victimized human merchandise of European enslavement. The Mandelas are a South African family immortalized because they represent victims of apartheid. African martyrdom can be seen as a historic transition from the enslavement of the Mandingos to the victimization of Nelson and Winnie Mandela. Martyrdom can be submissive, a resigned acceptance of suffering, or it can be combative, the use of one's suffering as a weapon. During the Holocaust, the Jews were submissive, but since then, they have used their suffering for combative purposes. The African experience of combative martyrdom includes the warrior and jihad traditions and the impact of modern revolutionary ideas. The transition from the legacy of Goree Island, packed with the Mandingos, to the anguish of Robben Island, confining the Nelson Mandelas. To bring this to Guyana, we had martyrs of injustice such as Blackie London, the Marchdale Breakers, Fine Man and his sister, and the Linden Martyrs. Combative revolutionary ideas came from Garvey, Nkrumah, and Jessica Huntley with her Bogo Louverture books. The transition is also from the martyrdom of Kofi, our Akan ancestor, forefather, to the African remand prisoners confined in the Georgetown jail. On genocide and slavery. In ancient Rome, before the conversion of Constantine, Roman Christians were martyrs to their faith. They were belief martyrs. The Mandingos or Malenkes and other Africans dragged across the Atlantic to this part of the world were martyrs to their being of the black African race. They suffered because of their identity rather than because of their faith. Our concern here is mainly martyrdom insofar as it affects African ancestry, but parallels will be drawn from time to time. The most extreme form of collective martyrdom are, first, genocide, the attempt to kill a whole group, a kind of collective murder, and second, enslavement, collective servitude. Both are two distinct types of extreme victimization. Genocide is a physical brutalization, annihilation, and extermination of an entire group. Enslavement is bondage, servitude, and physical exploitation, the reduction of human beings to commodities. Genocide is a declaration that a group is physically dispensable. One can get rid of the group. Enslavement is a declaration that the group is usable and profitable. To that extent, it is arguable that Africans are not necessarily the most brutalized people in modern history, but they are the most exploited, the most humiliated. Amerindians in the Western Hemisphere and the Jews under the Nazi may have a stronger claim to the dubious distinction of being the most brutalized in modern history. But in terms of humiliation, in terms of humiliation and exploitation, African martyrdom has been the worst of the cases before us. Humiliation is measured from where Africans started. The fall is greater if one came from a higher premise. The African continent is where self-reliance first emerged and where the human species itself first began. In Africa was the First Supper, not the Last Supper. The First Supper is a chronological event in the evolution of human culture where human beings first decided to get together and convert the satisfaction of a biological need into a time-specific human institution called supper. The story of the First Supper of Africans deserves to be told. In general, the very basic human institutions like language, meals, self-reliance originated in Africa. Africa was also the origin of grand civilizations. The First Supper and the first grand civilization originated in Africa. Now, what is the depth of the descent when they were chained and shipped? One measure of love is what one is willing to give up for it. One measure of humiliation is how low one's dignity is forced to descend. African people represented the most humiliated race in modern history because enslavement is a loss of dignity and freedom. Racism saved for African people the most telling insults. We are supposed to have too much sexual appetite, too little capacity to think, too slow to innovate, too ready to procrastinate. This type of racism is what Jessica Huntley engaged in combat with Bogle Louverture books. Let me repeat. Although Africans are not the most brutalized people of modern history, they are the most humiliated. Are Africans the most exploited in modern history? The answer to that is also positive. There are 4 phases of exploitation. First was the phase of the imperative labor, which led to enslavement. Second, the era of territorial imperative, and that imperative, the territorial imperative engulfed Africa, and she was arbitrarily partitioned. Third was the extractive imperative. Europe took the land and wanted what was underneath. African land included the wealth of minerals. What sealed the fate of the richest parts of Africa, particularly South Africa? Europeans originally went to South Africa not because there were minerals, but because the climate was congenial and the ecology beautiful. They then discovered minerals. 2 factors emerged: climatic congeniality and abundant minerals, and the martyrdom of the martyrs followed. The people of Guyana also suffered their own labor imperative, territorial imperative, and extractive imperative. The issue now: can climate congeniality and mineral resources be developed without exploitation? The last and 4th phase of this is what is called the market imperative. I want to come on to Jessica. Martyrdom, submissive, and combative. Martyrdom itself has 2 phases. It can be submissive. Jesus Christ carried the cross and what he was crucified, and he did not resist. One example of submissive martyrdom, the other interpretation is martyrdom as combative. One can use one's disadvantage as a weapon of confrontation. I have a note here that says East Indian martyrdom in Guyana was positive, but it also became combative in the personality of Chedi Jagan. It went on to speak about African own martyrdom as being costly, about the resistance that took place. As I said, I'm paraphrasing Mazrui's speech. And we speak of our national heroes, Kofi, Damon, and Commoner, as being combative martyrs. And it went on to say about having short memories of hate, sometimes too short. Ian Smith caused the death of thousands of Zimbabweans, and under Robert Mugabe, he lived a wealthy and free life. Jomo Kenyatta allowed more whites into Kenya than in colonial days. But he went on to speak about short memories of hate, and he touched on Guyana also. And he said he spoke about the battle between federal Nigeria and Ushuku. And he said the country's finest hour was not victory in war, but magnanimity in victory. And then he went on to Guyana, and he said, let us bury our silence, because we are a dual society, and so on. He then went on to speak about genocide, the gender of genocide. Women are martyrs to many types of pain, biological, cultural, and economic. And Jessica Huntley confronted humiliation and exploitation. She swam against the tide with her publishing house and her African bookshop. In my opinion, she was a combative martyr. I conclude by saying that Jessica Huntley was creative and diligent. Our greatest tribute to her would be to bring her home and give generations unborn a physical symbol of African togetherness, endeavor, and success. Jessica was loved by Eric and encouraged all to say something long before Bob Marley.